Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on when you may be watching this. I am Jamie Moeller, and this is the Grad Connection, where my goal is to try to help graduate students navigate their master's or their PhD programs. So we've been in the middle of this research series, and so we've kind of moved to qualitative approaches now, or excuse me, quantitative approaches. The last video was on qualitative. So I guess the first thing to, just as a reminder, to keep in mind that quantitative research, there are a couple different goals depending on who's talking about it or whatever, but one is to kind of understand the current state of the variables that are associated with your research question. Second would be, and probably most often, is to kind of like test an overall theory. And that theory typically involves one or more variables and the relationships between them. And then lastly, another type of quantitative research would be trying to understand the relationship between one or more variables. So all of these are kind of quantitative in nature. I think I have a video in here talking about the very different variable types, right? And so when I talk about variables, after you do your research question and you create hypotheses, those hypotheses kind of point to you. Actually, in between there is kind of where you kind of become cognizant of the variables that you're dealing with. Particularly when you're talking about experimental research, we oftentimes talk about dependent and independent variables and confounding variables. We talk about, so an independent variable is the variable typically that you're going to be manipulating in experimental research, because you're manipulating the independent variable to see a change in the dependent variable. And then confounding variables are variables that can affect the relationship between the dependent and independent variables. And they can be time-based, it can be contextual, they can be all kinds of things. So I think I have a video on variables. I probably need to go back and check and see if I do. So just like when I was talking about qualitative research, let's talk a little bit about characteristics of quantitative research. First and foremost, and these are in no particular order, but first and foremost, I would say the perspective of quantitative research is that it's objective, as opposed to qualitative research, which can be seen as more subjective. As a result, quantitative research typically is viewed as having less bias because the researcher is basically distanced from the thing being researched, as opposed to qualitative research. It's kind of the opposite, is the researcher is the tool. There is inherent bias, there's assumed bias, but the goal of the researcher is to kind of get the bias out there so that the reader can actually see through the lens of the researcher. In quantitative research, you typically your methodology is established or set from the start. So, you can't modify or change that, or at least you're not supposed to. The whole goal is to have all of pretty much the methodology set from the very beginning of the research, as opposed to having it be able to be evolved. So I would call it a fixed methodology as opposed to an emerging, so qualitative emerges. A way that sometimes people describe quantitative research is counting the beans, as opposed to qualitative research, which is kind of the goal is which beans are worth counting. And so that's kind of a way that you can separate them. Quantitative research is typically seen as like fact-based or value-free to a certain extent. I don't think there's totally an unbiased nature in quantitative research, but it's much, it's as close as we can get, I'll put it that way. Oftentimes you use a variety of instruments. Could be surveys, it could be all kinds of, it's not typically interviews and the kinds of things we talked about in qualitative. Instead, you're typically trying to reduce everything to numerical values that can then be assessed or analyzed using statistical tools. And so that's kind of a big difference. I think one of the overarching things, and I don't think I mentioned this when I was talking about qualitative research, but the overarching aim of quantitative research is to be able to generalize, right? To be able to take a small sample that represents a larger population, find something in that sample, and then generalize that to the entirety of the population, as opposed to qualitative research, which the whole goal is specificity, like, looking at individual units. You're not trying to generalize. And so that's a significant difference. You're also typically, when you're working with quantitative research, it's typically in a controlled setting. It's not in a naturalistic setting in most cases. And then lastly, as I mentioned before, here a minute ago, you have this whole idea of population sampling method, and pretty much everything that you do in quantitative research is based upon probability theory, right? And so having a background in probability theory helps you understand the nature of distributions, the nature of inferential statistics, which is typically the main thing that you use. So given all of that, those are all kinds of characteristics. Now, as I talk about the main types of quantitative research, just like with qualitative, there are lots of different ways that you can slice and dice this, lots of different views on the topic. So mine is just one. But I want to talk about kind of what I would see as the main 4 or 5 types of quantitative research. So the first would be just what I would call survey research. Now, in all reality, most researchers would not call this research. It's basically where you're using, it's basically the simplest type of, I'll call it information gathering. It's not really seen as research as it relates to folks that do research all the time. But nevertheless, you're gathering information about a group or a population, typically using some kind of survey mechanism, some kind of measurement tool. And typically what you're trying to do is kind of understand the broad set of characteristics about that group. And all you have are frequency counts. You're not really doing any analysis on it. You're not trying to understand necessarily the group as a whole, like you will in the second type of research that I talk about. But nevertheless, you're trying to get, it's basically like a survey that you would send out to a general population, and you just want to say, the majority of people said this, majority of people said that, with no other perspective on the data. So this is a survey kind of research is what I would is the kind of research that would happen typically in an undergraduate environment. More than likely, as a master's or PhD student, this is not going to count as research. Similarly, the second type of research that I would talk about is something called descriptive research. Again, descriptive research is very simple, very basic. Really, all you're doing is basically an assessment of the data collected about a group. And so you're kind of trying to take how a group responds to something or how it's measured. You have some measurement, right? It could be shoe size. It could be how they responded to question X on a survey or an exam. But it's then taking those responses and looking at them as a distribution of responses or a distribution of scores. And they're basically two, and what you're trying to do is describe that distribution, and you're trying to say what is or what was. So it can actually be, it's a capture in time, and you're trying to describe that data, as it were. Two main kinds of measures that you deal with in descriptive statistics or descriptive types of research. Measures of central tendency, so you're trying to find out where's the middle of the distribution of scores. Is it normal, that kind of thing. And then second would be variability, so what's the spread? Oftentimes we talk about descriptive statistics as it relates to scores in a classroom, right? So everybody in a class wants to know what was the average, what was the quote-unquote middle score, for better or worse. But we talk about measures of central tendency, we're talking about mode, we're talking about median, we're talking about average, we're talking about variability, talking to them about things like standard deviation or range or those kinds of things. Typically, when you take a beginning statistics course, this is kind of where they start, is talking about measures of central tendency, measures of variability, different types of distributions, and those and ways in which you can describe a distribution. So that's kind of like the second type of quote unquote research. Again, most researchers would not call descriptive research per se. Even though it's the beginnings, it's what leads into more advanced types of research, right? So you kind of have to have an understanding of descriptive statistics to be able to move into, quantitative into things. Third type of research. Now, this is more approaching something like correlation is what I'm talking about, is number 3. Correlation is simply understanding the relationship between two variables. And it's starting to get into the end of things where particularly master's students, I've seen a lot of correlation kinds of studies as it relates to master's students, and that's acceptable or appropriate for a master's level student. But again, you're trying to understand the relationship between two variables. For example, if one variable increases, what happens to the other? Does it decrease? Does it increase as well? Is there no relationship? So essentially what you're trying to do is understand what the relationships are between one or more variables. Oftentimes that's fundamental to developing a theory. Now, if I hearken back to what I said in the qualitative video, very first step is to even know what those variables are. What's at play? What's going on? And oftentimes qualitative research can be used to figure out what the variables are to begin with, as you explore and you try to understand what's going on. Then once you know what the variables are, then you can actually start testing, doing correlations to see what the relationships between those variables are. Then the next step in research would be, once you understand those relationships, you can start to develop a theory about what's going on, and then you can use experimental research, which is the fourth type, to kind of do cause and effect types of testings and things. So all of these kind of dovetail into them. They basically, in my opinion, kind of build upon one another. But so correlation, which is number 3, it's understanding the relationship between variables, how one variable impacts the other. You're not manipulating variables necessarily. You're basically taking and measuring 2 variables and seeing what that relationship is. Again, it's kind of a state of what is or what was. So all of the things that I've talked about thus far, survey research, descriptive research, and correlation, these are all trying to describe what is or what was. It's not trying to predict into the future, because that's one of the big things that makes experimental research different from what I would call this grouping of, you could just call it descriptive overall, right? So when we move into the what I would call fourth type of research, now this fourth type can actually be divided, at least in my mind, into 3 separate other things too. So it depends on how you want to slice and dice again. But when we talk about this fourth category, which I'll just first generally call group studies, and experimental would probably be a better word, just call it experimental research. When you move into that category, really what you're talking about is inferential statistics. You're trying to infer from a small group to a larger group, and this is where you're trying to generalize in a very big way. You're trying to predict, you're trying to actually be able to project into the future, as opposed to, the other types of research we just talked about is really about what is or what was. So it's like looking at today or back. Inferential is looking forward. So, to me, this fourth category, experimental, can be divided into 3 separate categories. One would be what is called true experimental research, and I'll describe what these are here in a minute. Second would be quasi-experimental, and then the third kind of grouping would be what's called ex post facto or causal comparative. So let's begin with experimental. So experimental is really kind of where the bulk of masters, and particularly, certainly PhD level research that's quantitative in nature. It's typically this kind of research that you're doing. Essentially, experimental research is cause-effect types of, where you're trying to figure out cause and effect types of relationships. This is where you end up where the cause would be the independent variable, the effect would be the dependent variable, and what you're trying to understand is the relationship between those things. Probability theory and understanding of how probability works is critical to having a base level understanding of how the statistics work and how you meld that with inferential, with experimental research, right? So oftentimes as you learn statistics, and this is usually a very common part of most master's and PhD programs, is teaching you how to understand probability theory, how to apply that in a research scenario. Because essentially all you're doing when you're doing experimental research is you're trying to figure out within some certain probability whether you're going to find something, whether something happened by chance or not. So I'm not going to dive into all probability theory and all that, because I'm not a probability theorist by any stretch, but I do have a base level understanding of how you apply that to research. So experimental research is cause and effect. It's based on probability, or an understanding of probability is fundamental. Oftentimes what you're doing in experimental research is you're creating groups of measures, and then you're analyzing both across those groups, what's the relationship across those groups, what's the relationship within those groups. Random sampling, right? Because essentially, and there are strict rules relative to this in quantitative studies as to essentially, you're wanting to describe something about an entire population, but you basically use a sample, a small subset of that, to infer to that. So that's experimental. Second would be quasi-experimental research. Again, you're still looking at cause and effect amongst variables and that kind of thing, but instead of using random sampling, you're using pre-existing groups. A lot of educational things it basically use a quasi-experimental approach because you're using pre-existing groups of people. So like if I'm at a university and I'm testing some educational intervention, I'm using pre-existing groups of students that are in different sections of a class, for example. Now, quasi-experimental research is oftentimes seen as a little less strong in its results as opposed to experimental, but still a valid approach. And then the third type, and I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time talking about, is something called ex post facto or causal comparative research. And in this, you have no random assignment of folks, and you have no treatment. And I'll just park that because that's the least common kind, at least in my view. The least common kind of research that you would be doing as a master's or PhD. So kind of like with the qualitative research discussion, this kind of gives you a kind of a smattering or an overview. Again, keep in mind that if you do a search on quantitative research methodologies in Google or wherever, you're going to find people describe these things in different ways. It's really just kind of, this is, as I've laid it out, this is kind of how I think about it or how I've arranged it within my brain. But realize that in quantitative research, after you select the particular method that you're going to use, and usually the method is apparent based upon the questions you're asking, based upon what instruments you're going to be using to collect information, what types of variables they are. But essentially, after you kind of solidify all of this kind of leads you to the particular statistical tool that you would actually use. And so when I'm talking about statistical tool, I would say like t-test, matched pairs t-test, an ANOVA, an ANCOVA, a MANOVA, and all kinds of derivations thereof. And there's all kinds of different, there are 1,001 statistical tools, and I'm not a statistics expert. I know kind of the high level, but I don't know, all of the nuances of various tests. Now, I will say if you are a Purdue student, I would highly encourage, and if you're at any other university, I would encourage you to look and see if you have, a lot of universities have like a statistics consulting service that's typically free for students. Purdue certainly has that. The statistical consulting service that's offered at Purdue. Oftentimes, if I have students that are working on quantitative research, I oftentimes, even if I kind of feel like I know what is best for them to use, I will still send them to the consulting service just to verify, because I'm not a stat researcher. That is a researcher who is developing new statistical tools to do research. And oftentimes I like to have graduate students just confirm and so that they truly understand soup to nuts exactly what they're doing and why, not just because I directed them to. Because part of becoming a master's or PhD graduate is being somewhat versed in statistical methods relative to the kinds of research that you do. So with that, this kind of concludes this clip on quantitative research. I think I've got a couple, I forget where I'm going after this, but I still have a few topics I want to cover in this research series. And then I'm going to do a kind of an evaluation of whether I continue these videos or not. I guess part of it has to do with whether I have much more to say, or if something comes to my mind as a topic that seems important. So with that, I hope you're finding it useful. Thanks for the comments. Thanks for dropping me lines and just providing feedback on these videos. I very much appreciate it. Hopefully you're finding them helpful. Have a great day. Bye-bye.